Hello, biology students. Today we're going to go through some of the stages of cellular respiration in some more detail. And I know you started in an activity yesterday and some of you got through parts of this, so hopefully you have a little bit of an understanding of kind of what's going on. But remember, cellular respiration is all about making energy for the cell, and what that means for living things in the cell is making that ATP. So it's all about making AT. That is like, you know, the whole point of us eating food is to power processes in our cells, and that happens by the making of ATP. So we're going to talk about cellular respiration in 3 stages. First is glycolysis, then the Krebs cycle, which is also called the citric acid cycle sometimes, and then the electron transport chain and chemoosmosis. The biggest chunk of cellular respiration really does happen in the organelle called the mitochondria. So the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. It's where ATP is made. When we studied cell organelles, we mentioned that. But it's a pretty complicated process by which ATP is made. And so that's why we break this into 3 stages. The first is glycolysis, glycolysis is literally just the splitting of the glucose molecule. Technically, this has to happen before this enters into the mitochondria. So glycolysis actually happens in the cytosol outside the mitochondria. And then we're going to talk about building up of charges on between the inner and outer mitochondrial membrane. Remember when we learned about mitochondria, we said the inner membrane of the mitochondria has all of these folds, and that the whole purpose of these folds are to increase surface area on that inner membrane, because this is where ATP is made. And it actually is powered by charges, and we're going to talk about this during the electron transport chain. We have a buildup of opposite charges on either side of this inner mitochondrial membrane. Nature does not like a concentration gradient like this, where there's, you know, more of something on one side of the membrane and less on the other side. And so the actually movement of this through the membrane is actually going to power the creation and making of ATP by this enzyme called ATP synthase. So I like this visual right here. This is taken from a textbook, although not your textbook, a different textbook, but this is gives a really nice kind of overview of cellular respiration, beginning with here's the food that we eat. And it may be proteins, carbohydrates, or fats, which need to get broken down. A lot of them get broken down into glucose. You can see with fats, there's some, like the fatty acids actually kind of bypass that step, and there's some parts in proteins that also bypass that step. But some of that gets broken down into glucose. We have glucose being made, and then glycerol and some of these amino acids will also go through that process of glycolysis. So remember, we said that's the first step in cellular respiration, is breaking down that glycolysis cycle where glucose is broken down, and we get glucose is a 6-carbon sugar, and it makes 2 of these 3-carbon pyruvate or pyruvic acid molecules. And those then basically get fed into the Krebs cycle, also called the citric acid cycle, where they go through, each pyruvic acid molecule is going to go through, you know, 1 round of this Krebs cycle. From the activity we did yesterday, you saw how the NAD is converted to NADH, the FAD is converted to FDH2. There's carbon dioxide given off in this process as a byproduct, and so on. And then some things are then fed into this electron transport chain, and this really is and we're going to talk more about this, but this really is where the bulk of the ATP is made. So we get a little bit of ATP here and here, but we get the biggest chunk of our ATP actually comes from this electron transport chain. So, in discussing how do cells convert food into energy, this is the basic overview of the chemical equation for cellular respiration. So we take some glucose, some oxygen, a whole bunch of things happen, and we get carbon dioxide produced, water produced, and energy in the form of ATP. So again, this is a super duper overview of that process. The process as a whole really is about organic molecules like glucose, and for us as heterotrophs, it's about the food that we eat getting broken down, and we're going to harvest the energy from that food. We want to make ATP with that because ATP fuels those cellular processes. We don't live very long without ATP, and we need a lot of it, okay? There's a lot of processes that require that. Again, that first step, we've mentioned this several times, but I just want to get it in writing. That first step is glycolysis, which actually happens in the cytosol. The cytosol is the gel-like fluid. A lot of times we say cytoplasm. It's the same thing, except the cytoplasm is the gel-like fluid with all the organelles floating around in it. Cytosol is just the gel-like fluid. So glycolysis happens in the cytosol. We split the glucose into a couple of pyruvic acid or pyruvate molecules, same thing. This results in the production of actually 4 ATP, but it uses a couple of them up. So it makes 4 ATP molecules, but then uses a couple of them up. So we only have 2 net net production, of 2 ATP. We also get a couple of NADP molecules as well. So after glycolysis, the path that it takes really depends on if we have oxygen present or not. So we always get 2 pyruvate or pyruvic acid molecules. If oxygen is absent, we get something called fermentation, which can be, so we either get the production of alcohol or we get the production of lactic acid. So one of those 2 things is fermentation if there's no oxygen, or sometimes with single-celled organisms like some bacteria, we actually get something called anaerobic respiration. Anaerobic literally means without oxygen, and guess what? Some bacteria don't need oxygen. Some of them can tolerate oxygen, and it doesn't matter to them whether they have oxygen or don't have oxygen. Others actually can't be around oxygen, and they have to be in environments where there's almost no oxygen, and oxygen is actually toxic to them. So it depends on the bacteria, but there are lots of bacteria that are anaerobic. If oxygen is present, oh, by the way, not much ATP produced here, so that's a bummer. If this happens in our cells, and by the way, we'll talk a little bit more about this. Runners and athletes maybe know a little bit about this. We'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. Oxygen present, now we're talking about aerobic or with oxygen respiration. This makes the mother lode of ATP. This is the goal. This is what we're going for right here. This is what we want. So again, just to put this into some words, that anaerobic pathway, we have glycolysis, but then it can't go through that whole Krebs cycle and so forth and make all of this ATP and so on and so forth. Instead, it leads to fermentation, which either is lactic acid fermentation, so the pyruvic acid is used up and NAD plus and lactic acid is produced. This can happen in athletes, in muscles. If you're, and I'm not a runner, but if you're a runner, We have someone in our class who is. You really have to worry a little bit about this lactic acid buildup, and other athletes do too. But if you know how when you start doing something physical and your body, you start to breathe more heavily, your body, that's a trigger. It's a response of, oh my goodness, I need more oxygen. I need to get it in here faster. And so you breathe more and more heavily. At some point, if you are doing very rigorous work, and you really can't get enough oxygen, you do get some lactic acid buildup in your muscles. And so this is one of the causes of muscle soreness. Other causes of muscle soreness can actually be little tears in the muscles. Those of you who lift weights maybe know about that. But you do, or running too. I mean, that's like a crazy stressor on your muscles, obviously. But anyway, you get this lactic acid buildup. There are some things that, so if your coach says make sure that you stretch after exercise, so really stretch those muscles out, that can help release the lactic acid, and that's really important. If I do a workout like any sort of aerobic workout, there's always a cool down at the end where we do all these stretches, and it really does help prevent sore muscles, and part of that is releasing that lactic acid. The other thing, and we see this more obviously in things like yeast and so forth, so alcohol fermentation, that lactic acid is used up, NAD+, and ethyl alcohol is produced. This is how wine and beer is made. It can, like I'm into making sourdough bread, and sourdough also, same kind of thing. You keep that starter either in the fridge or on the counter and feed it periodically, but you get alcohol collecting at the top, and that's part of what gives sourdough bread its sour taste. It's not alcoholic for you to drink or to eat the bread or anything like that. It's small quantities, and in the cooking process, and you can even pour that part off, but there's definitely, you're letting that ferment, so it actually is producing some carbon dioxide, but also some alcohol in that process. So again, we are all about that aerobic respiration because that produces the most ATP. That pyruvic acid that is generated during glycolysis, when the glucose molecule splits, diffuses into the mitochondria, and then enters into the Krebs cycle, where you're going to get some more ATP produced in this cycle. And I'm going to go through, in the next recording, I'll go through the steps in the process of the Krebs cycle. So this video was just glycolysis and an overview of the 3 processes.